my own, and it was just so easy to get to. You know, to go to Liverpool, get on the ferry, get off it, and you're there. It just kind of happens. But going with Neil was so much easier. It was a very, very good trip, and it was an extraordinary place, and it really did kind of grip me, really. So the Isle of Man, Manannán mac Lir, as it was known, was the son of Lir, the god of the sea. And it's halfway across the Irish Sea, and you pass a really extravagantly large wind farm to get there nowadays on the ferry. But it was really very, very good. The famous coat of arms is the three legs of man, who always run clockwise. And basically the motto says, whichever way you throw it, it will stand. And that's, you know, it's not like an Olympic Games type thing or anything like that. And I think it's that the weather buffets the man so much during the winter time that they must have felt that it was shifted off its moorings a few times back in the day. And as I say, that's the beginnings of the interest in it, really. It's a very, very curious symbol to have. As I say, always goes clockwise. But say, you just get the Steam Packet Company ferry to Douglas, and you get off the boat, and then you're there. And it's odd, it has four-horned sheep, which are kind of irresistible. You have the tailless cats. You have the TT races, where they just glumly accept that a couple of people will die every year. It's just the way it is. You take risks, sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. But it's obviously the biggest money spinner on the island these days and has been for a very, very long time. And Thomas the Tank Engine was meant to be based on one of the old narrow gauge railways that they have there, which is 125 years old. They have trams as well. You can get around very, very easily, but it has enormous charm. That was the thing that surprised me. As a tourist destination, I thought, if you'll forgive me, Kevin, I thought it was going to be a bit like Blackpool. It so is not. It was, you know, just a great little place to explore. So we went to a field where there were 3 Viking longhouses and nobody there, except a few sheep. And you know, wherever we went, we were the only people there, which surprised me, because these things are world class in lots of ways, really. And we went to a wooded place. I have no idea where it was, but it was absolutely hopping alive with nature spirits. It was quite exceptional for that. I was surprised. Now, I can be gullible and cynical in equal measure, and that place was notable. We went across the Fairy Bridge, of course, and said hello to them, because if you don't, you'll have a car accident. So it's always best to know that. And so it was a delight, because you'd be going along in countryside, you'd turn a corner, and there was the sea. And you were downhill, up Dale, or up the other way round. And it was, just as I say, it was just properly exciting, really. So this is... Dora Broom wrote of the island, "On the island, the gold of the gorse comes right down to the sea, and the hills are purple with heather, and the banks thick with primroses in spring. Gulls flash in the sunlight, and seals bask on the rocks or slip silently into the sea. But in the winter, storms lash the coast, and the waves leap up in columns of spray, and the cries of the gulls in the wind. This is the scene against which the stories are told of the little fellows, the giants, the Finnodarí, and the Bagantes." They have their own language still on the island, and the Finnodarí will heal your cattle for you, and they live in elder trees, and they play the flute to enchant, basically, and they're small creatures who do no harm. With all fairy stories, there seems to be that you can have something that is evil-tempered that you can kind of tame, or you can really upset something that is otherwise very, very, very charming. And they are much the same. They can give your cattle a hard time if necessary. The Buganes, or however you do pronounce it, they blow smoke down your chimney and cause absolute chaos. You don't want soot in your oatmeal in the mornings, really. And they're a dirty thing to have around. That's the annoyance of them. They take a lot of clearing up after them, so it's best to stay on their good side, really. they're very dirt and dust aware, like most people now, not just pre-industrial societies. And if you swept the dirt towards your neighbour, you ill-wishing them. But if you swept their dirt towards your house, you were taking something of theirs that you could make use of. So there's a lot of dirt, earth and dirt stuff going on there too. It was a massively successful holiday destination from Victorian times, because people from Ireland, people from the north of England went over there, and they had the land, and they just built the hotels and the bed and breakfasts and everything else as well. They put in the infrastructure to cope with the people. The airport was the UK's biggest, most busy airport in the 1950s. They were dealing with 650,000 people a year through that tiny little island. Quite extraordinary. And it was doing very, very well until the 1970s, when this place, Summerlands, which was built to accommodate the holiday camp people who had gone from being in tents left over from and bought from as army surplus by the 100, they were beginning to build proper places for people with 2,000 people having breakfast together and all the rest of it. Summerlands was built by two architects who designed two buildings that didn't quite join up ever, so it was an uncomfortable place to use. And then three lads from Liverpool were having a cigarette in a kiosk. The kiosk caught fire, so did the building because it was plastic clad. 50 people died, 80 people were severely injured, and that put an end to going to the Isle of Man for a lot of people for a long time. And it was also timed in with the cheap flights to Spain, where you could get cheap booze and guaranteed sunshine, which in the middle of the Irish Sea you really can't guarantee. And it suffered accordingly then. It became a very poor island for a long time. Then you got people discovering that it was a really useful, very close tax haven. And there's a significant, extraordinary wealth on the island. And then other people just bump along, barely making a living, really. So there have been several notables who've lived on the island, and they're not just like Jeremy Clarkson, who's registered there for tax purposes. There was William Kennish, who was a poet and a Victorian philanthropist, and he was the man who, what did he do to it? He surveyed the Panama Canal. You have Barry and Robin and Maurice Gibb, the Bee Gees, who were born there. You have, and Frank Commode was as well. And the woman who invented Wonder Woman deserves a mention as well, I think, really. Her name was Elizabeth Marston. So the folklore of the Isle of Man starts with the speculation about the Viking Lady of Peel. She has now been moved to York, I think it is, and her grave was double lined, which is rare. It was sandstone and slate. She was 5'6", something like that. She had rickets, and because there was so much sea around and so many fish around, the presumption is that she was vitamin D deficient because she'd had multiple pregnancies. But she had wealth, she had status, and that shows in her grave goods very, very, very clearly. And hers was the richest Viking period woman's grave in the UK, and I think it still is. And she had a purse, she had cooking pots, combs, shears, decorated knives, bronze needles, and there was also a cooking spit which was wrapped in a few layers of cloth, and they still have some goose feathers attached. She was buried with the things that she used, like anybody sensible would be, really. Her necklace had 73 beads in it, and they came from here, there, and everywhere. Obviously, it's a seafaring place, and I don't get why people don't think there was global travel in the old days. basically, if you set off by sea, you are governed by the tides, and you get somewhere and you have to stay the winter because you're waiting for the sea to blow you back home again. And so in that time, you talk, you make mates, you make friends, you promise to bring them something from home next time, you bring a wife or a husband back with you, and so on. And her things, there's faience, there's all sorts of things, there's Baltic amber, obviously, there's many bits and pieces from around the world in her necklace. She also had a pestle and mortar, which is the dinkiest little thing, and it's as if she made herbal concoctions for the fairy folk. It's so wee, it's ridiculous. It might have been a cosmetic thing that she but obviously, that we won't ever know that really. And she also had a triangular bladed knife, which is unique, and nobody's really worked out what that was for. And I believe that it was incised with things, with symbols as well. So she's a fascinating case, really. But the whole island has just got so much ancient stuff on it. There are abundant Stone Age goods, and there's Mesolithic stuff. They're very well represented. The German beaker folk were there. People from East Anglia were there in the Bronze Age. One of the plentiful Ogham stones is 5th century and says, Davidu, son of the Druid. You can just go and see it. It's just in a churchyard. You just wander about and you find these extraordinary things. The Parliament, or the Tindwold, was established in 979, and this was done by John Warwick Smith, and is in the Manx art collection. And it has a marvellous example of a giant's grave that can be seen next to it, and you can see it really well because they conveniently sliced it in half when they built the road there. So you can see what the innards of a giant, just like a slice of cake, what you can see what a giant's grave was like. It was also where they used to put suspected witches into barrels, where they had nailed barrels and nailed through it, then put the witch in it, and then rolled them down the hill, which must have hurt whether you were a witch or whether you weren't. So, it makes you wonder how many other brutal ways of dealing with people that have just been lost to us. I think mercifully in some ways, but it's a classic ancient way of being very unpleasant. There's not much written about the folklore of the island, except there are recurrences in Scottish and Irish folk tales to some extent. But it wasn't until the clergy were properly literate in the 17th century that they began to record who was a pain in the neck, who was called a witch, who was putting the evil eye on people, and so on. And there's quite a good amount of stuff recorded from that. The witches were often called out for putting the evil eye on people, as I say, but also they could take the tara off somebody's land or their cattle, or even stop their family thriving, because the tara was the increase, it was the fertility of the land. And if you upset someone, say there was a woman who didn't have much, and she came along and said, could I have could I have some extra corn that you've ground for somebody else? Could I have enough to make a loaf, please? If you said no, you couldn't, push off, you're a beggar, I'm having nothing to do with you. They'd say fair enough then, and they would find that their fine corn was turned to chaff, more or less. And so it was best to look after the poor to some extent, because these people could be malevolent, and well, often they were desperate people. But there are a lot of tales of, like the dust, the earth from one place to another. You could take, if you upset someone, they could take, using their besom, they could take the increase, they could take the tara from your land, or or your cattle or whatever. There was one woman who was tried for a witch, and she said, but I'm not. Well, she didn't say anything, actually, and her husband kept saying, no, you're not, darling, are you? And she just kept looking at him, and she went to court about it, and he said, in the end, tell them that you're not. And so, renounce the devil and all his works. And so she said, I renounce the devil and all his works, but you there, don't you ever dare think that anyone in your family will have as much wealth as mine has, and I mean this for umpteen generations. Your family will never thrive again. So she kind of showed she could have been a witch with that last statement, because that was full of malice, but overall, they were used for good, the wise women. I haven't found any reports of wise men yet. I'm sorry. It could have been because they all went to sea and half of them drowned. I don't know, but I have looked, honest, and I just haven't found any yet. So this is the highest point on the island, which is South Barul, and it's 1,585 feet high above sea level, and it's peppered with Iron Age items. There's a useful film on Vimeo, which lasts 7 or 8 minutes, and it's called the South Barul Hill Fort, and it's a chap talking about the size of it and the age of it and what they found there and everything else as well. And it's just handy, I think, if you for that sort of stuff. But it's an island of hills and, as I say, and unexpectedly high bits. And as I say, the beauty of it is quite remarkable, really. The Celtic raths or roundhouses, they're 90 feet in diameter. They're still just sitting in fields. There's just you and the sheep. You have it all to yourself always. And they have sunshine, which I'm not sure that the north actually has. I haven't experienced sunshine in the north yet. I know I'm a long way off my comfort zone because I've run out of tube line, but it's, overcast, I understand up here, but I haven't seen the sun yet. And Christianity was established in the 5th century there, and again, huge Irish influence all around. Their language is very heavily Irish, their speech patterns are Irish, their accents even now are a real mixture of English, Irish and Scots to listen to. The influences just get carried on down through the families still. They have these tiny little churches called Killeels, which again are 5th century, and they have pre-Norse crosses or Ogham stones like these, which are all over the island, although a third of them are at Maughold, if that's how you pronounce that, Maughold. Oh, sorry? Maughold? How would I ever know that? It's my bad, I should have made a note of the person who in Victorian times said he went around, he found them all, he noted them all, he recorded them all, he then had them moved to the local churchyards to protect them all as well. So you get these fantastic outcroppings of them in churchyards. There are some in churches still. They have fully embraced the ancient history of the Isle of Man, without a doubt. And then you have people like Archibald Knox, the famous Art Nouveau designer who helped establish Liberty's and Tiffany's and places like that as a designer. He came from the island, he lived on the island for a very long time, and he had his own grave marker designed to honour the past as well. There have been various other celebrities, like Jeff the Talking Mongoose. Very strange story, this. Is it a classic pubescent girl and poltergeist? Is it a very strange, slightly shell-shocked father that she had? Is it a very depressed and frightened and intimidated by her husband wife? We'll never know. But Jeff the Talking Mongoose would only talk through walls at people, not just in the house, but in the outlying farm buildings. And he appeared in the early 30s and carried on for some long time. He obviously became a local celebrity because somebody from the BBC came along, and a reporter from the Liverpool Echo or somewhere picked him up first of all. And these were people who were real subsistence farmers. But Jeff had attitude, and he was he liked talking with the daughter, And he became known as Jeff the Talking Mongoose because he told them that's what he was and that was his name. He told the family that he was a yellow mongoose and claimed to have been born in New Delhi in 1852. So how he got to the Isle of Man, other than by a seaman or a returning soldier or whatever, but he waited 80 years to apparently appear to anybody on the island. He was cheeky, he was mischievous, he was threatening even, but he was quite sociable, and he would accompany the family to market. He would always be the other side of the hedge, chitter-chattering away to them, so nobody could see him, and he stayed out of sight and didn't want to cause a ruckus or have to give autographs because he couldn't do that. And so he was with them for quite some years, really. Harry Price, the paper bag salesman turned psychical researcher, had a massive success with The Haunting of Borley Rectory in Essex. And this was written by a book written by Chris Joseph a few years ago, who worked at the Harry Price Library in London University, as part of London University. And he went through all the papers very, very, very thoroughly. And the book's still in print. But Harry Price was, after the success of Borley, was always looking for another way of keeping his name in the papers. And Jeff was just irresistible to him. And he never came down firmly on Jeff being real or being imaginary, because that kept the story going. Whereas you had people like Dr. Nandor Fodor, who was a Hungarian psychical researcher, but chairman of the Society of Psychical Research, who said that in his opinion, there really was something there, and that Jeff was more than likely absolutely real. I dislike Harry Price intensely. I think he was a coarse, unpleasant, sneering man who was out for himself always. And he helped with I nearly said the crucifixion of Helen Duncan, who was the spiritualist medium who was so accurate during the war that the government shut her down. And Harry Price had investigated her because he could make money out of her. She was an illiterate Scottish woman who had 6 or 8 kids, and her life is a terrible tale of poverty, really, because she had to be away from home for long times. She was a teenager. No, at school she could barely read, barely write, and was a dunce. And then every so often she would hold her slate to her chest, and when she took it away, the correct answer was written on the slate. She never knew how that was, but spirit worked through her from being about 7, 8, 9 years old. By the time she was a teenager, she was dreaming of a man who was at war, and she went to her friend's house, and it turned out to be her friend's brother, who was in the Black Watch and had just been invalided out from having a very, very, very hard time of it over there in the First World War. And it was the man she'd been dreaming of. He'd been dreaming of her too, and so they got married. So by then, he'd had a heart attack, and his body was just shot. There was no hope he was ever going to have full health again. She had multiple pregnancies. She had She was working in the linen fields, and she had frozen kidneys. She was hospitalised before she died. Her health was appalling all her life, but she was the main breadwinner always. They had these various kids, and one died. One was born at 2.5 pounds. The next one was born at 10 pounds. They had another child on the way. She was about to die, they genuinely thought. So the kids were farmed out to friends who were living in a caravan, and a rat ate one of the daughter's faces. The daughter survived, never forgave her mother again. This is all pre-antibiotics. This is poverty. Poverty still exists. We're not far away from that, anywhere around anywhere these days. But she had awful, awful, awful times. But she had this technique of being able to bring through full physical manifestations of people in the spirit world. And she was absolutely extraordinary, and that's how she kept the family fed. So Harry Price investigated her because his lab was above the offices of the Society for Psychical Research, and he just called them those people downstairs, didn't want to know. And he caused this thing to say that she wasn't legitimate, that she wasn't actually accurate. So that caused great difficulty. During the war, she was down in Portsmouth. She had a full physical manifestation of a lad who'd been shipwrecked and killed at sea. During the war, the cap bands just said Her Majesty's HMS. No, they just said whatever they did, but they didn't have the name of the ship. She named the ship. Now, Portsmouth was full of gossip about what was happening because people had been rescued and people coming back on leave. The whole place was just gossiping about the war. Fair enough. Nobody knew about the Barham going down at that stage. The Commander Firebrace, who was in charge of the Secret Services up in Scotland, had... I'm sorry, this is a terrible diversion, but she was so wronged, and people like Harry Price, he set her up twice, basically. Anyway, Firebrace, who she'd known him for 10 years, he rang the Admiralty and said, "Is this true?" They said, "Yeah, how the hell do you know about that? Because nobody knows that yet." So instead of her just being taken to the local court and giving, a 50p fine and told, not to do it again, it ended up in the High Court, where they had to find what could they possibly do her under, and it took weeks and weeks and weeks, and they had to use the Witchcraft Act of 1735, even though she was not a witch, and it was a great cause célèbre, and the spiritualists were fantastic. They were like the pagans now, and they rallied round and they said, "Excuse us, you're using Gestapo tactics on this poor woman, and this is exactly what we're fighting against. How very dare you," kind of idea. Harry Price firmly on the sidelines, sneering and jeering, because he'd already set her up. So then there's a whole other backstory to that I won't go into, but then actually they did it again because she carried on being a very, very good medium, and they did it to her again just before the Suez Crisis, because in that time, interrupting a spirit when they're in trance is extraordinarily dangerous. And this time she had burns on her body as big as side plates. And this woman had been humiliated all her working life. People said she had two stomachs like a cow, that she could regurgitate things. She used to have ectoplasm, 10 feet of ectoplasm coming out of her nose. And you try it, even if you could stuff 8 or 10 feet of cheesecloth down your nose, how the hell do you project it out into the room if you're bound hands and legs to a chair? Anyway, but as I say, so anything that Harry Price says is deeply suspect as far as I'm concerned, about Jeff or about anything else as well. So the island, as I say, it carried on long-established families, long-established ways of life, virtually uninterrupted for centuries, for thousands of years, really. And then the tourists arrive, and in the 1930s, the first witchcraft museum was set up there. But I thought I'd treat you to some of the traditional folk stories of there, which are based in particular places on the island. And there was a fisherman, Ben Varry, and she fell in love with a fisherman called Sam Collier, which unnerved him because he was an incredibly shy young man. He'd classically never been kissed, really. And it amused his fisherfolk friends that this mer girl would follow the boat and sing to him and be very beguiling and all the rest of it. And he was just sort of covered in confusion and terribly embarrassed by it, really. And she then started coming on land and bringing him gifts of seaweed and of shells and little crabs and things like that. And he didn't know how to cope with it, a spotty teenager. And his mother got really annoyed eventually after several days of this. And so she shouted at the mermaid and said, just go away and never come back, kind of idea. You leave my boy alone, sort of thing. So the very next morning, then they woke up to find their entire garden covered in seaweed that the mermaid had dumped there, because and the fishermen's boats, the nets went out. They pulled them up heavy, and there were no fish in them, and things like that. So she was in a proper sort of teenage strop, this mermaid, really, and they couldn't carry on with no fish. So he very sensibly went to see the wise woman, and said, how on earth do we deal with this? And so the wise woman recommended that he took the mermaid a string of glass beads, because everybody knows that mer people are very, very vain, and that he took her a comb as well, because she had beautiful long blonde hair, and he also needed to take along his mum's wedding ring, put it on his finger, and take that along as well. And when the mermaid appeared, he had to say, Ben Varry, go back to thee home. Here's beads for thee neck, for your gold hair a comb. By this ring on me finger, I swear not to wed, till the sea from our island of Mannin has fled. Which means never, in your lifetime, love. So he was still very unsure that there was any actual marrying and giving of presents and giving of, marriage under the sea. The lad went shopping, and he bought a nice glass necklace, and he bought a comb, and the next night, excuse me, it was a lovely big yellow moon, so he could see her beautiful golden hair as she swang alongside the boat, and he got all flummoxed, and he was all ready, and then he realised that he didn't quite remember what he had to say, and he was all in a state, and so he got the charm wrong, and he actually said, Ben Varry, go back to thee home. Here's beads for the neck, and for your gold hair a comb. By this ring on me finger, I swear thee to wed, and be true until the sea from the island has fled. Well, so he threw the comb and he threw the beads back into the sea, and the ring fell off his finger and straight onto the mermaids, of course, and she dived deep with her prizes. She got her man. So his friends laughed themselves sick at this, basically. And Sam then suddenly thought that it might not be a bad thing to be married to a mermaid, and decided that a wife with a lovely singing voice and a long tail was better than one with a sharp tongue. Teenagers, who'd have them? So that decided his fate, and he gave up fishing, because he preferred to sit on the rocks and just listen to her sing and look at her comb her hair, and he was just completely smitten with her, really. So 3 of his mates went to the wise woman, and they said, this can't carry on, what can we do? How do we undo the magic, really? So she said that they had to boil herring for 3 days and then grind it into a powder on the 3rd day, and then Sam's mother had to put it in his tea, and then when they should go out to sea all together, and when they saw the mermaid, they should drop some vervain into the sea, and they had to say, Ben Varry, go back to thee home, till the sea from on our Mannin doth roam. Find a mate with a tail, for if thee Sam would wed, in the deep of the sea he'd be drowned and dead. Not unreasonable. So they had to then they'd made a cross made of rowan wood, and they had to take that on the boat with them, and then they had to stick a knife into the mast to sort of get out of there fast, because that would whistle up the wind, and go for home as fast as they could. Whistling up the wind was a way that witches made money at the seaside for centuries, and knotted cords with you undoing one knot, not bad. It'll keep you afloat and get you where you want to go. 2, you're risking things a bit, but there'll be a strong wind, so if you're in difficulties, it'll blow you home. Undo 3 knots, and all hell breaks loose. Nobody ever undoes the 3rd knot if they've got any sense at all. So, but as I say, they stuck the knife in, and there was the worst storm that anybody could ever remember. It was talked about for years and years and years afterwards. And of course, Sam wouldn't agree to say his line. The others couldn't remember quite who was going to say which other line, and they all got it terribly wrong, and they shouted the bits that they could remember in any order, and then they stuck the knife in the mast to whistle down the wind, and it was just a terrible, terrible mess. But in the middle of the tempest, somebody heard a ping and looked down, and there was Sam's mother's wedding ring back again. All right? So it had been slung back at them by this furious screeching. You know, if she'd had feet, she would have stomped them. Mermaid, basically. So they all got home safely. But Sam never did marry. And there is a tombstone somewhere, if you look for it, that has his name, and it says bachelor in very large capital letters. So that's one of the tales of the island. Then this is Scarlet, because there is a lot of red around there. And there was a fisherman who lived at Scarlet, and he had to leave his beautiful daughter. All daughters are beautiful. I don't know whether it's just because their dads think they are, or if they're teenagers and the dustman says they're beautiful, they believe it, or what it is. But in these tales, these either go, like everybody else, they're either unfortunate to look at or they're beautiful. Anyway, so he says, "I'm off to market, darling. I'll be back late. Don't let anybody in. Don't be daft. Just, get about your spinning. And, I may be home late, but I'll get back to you." So, of course, that was fine. And not to answer the door to anyone. They'd obviously read Goldilocks or something like that. So, and he would knock 3 times so that she would know that it was him. So all was well. And till there was the all too expected storm. And eventually there were 3 thunderous knocks which were fit to take the door off its hinges. The girl, by this time, had her dad buried, dead and buried 10 times over, because it was late, it was dark, the candles had gone out, she was frightened, she was on her own, even the cat had gone to bed, and then suddenly the door's not fit to be burst down. And she opens it, thinking it was her dad in great difficulty, and there was this rather gorgeous young man who had water in his hair and, lovely looking eyes and all the rest of it, and rather exotic looking, rather a bit foreign. And so nobody is ever rude to a stranger, even in those circumstances. So she invited him in because he was soaked through, and she decided he was foreign because he didn't understand English and she didn't understand whatever the hell he was saying. And so by, the way you do when you're abroad, you cope. And he didn't want anything to eat, but he indicated that he was tired. So he lay down by the fire and she sat and looked at him and drooled over him a bit as well, really. And he was lying asleep on the hearth in front of the turf fire with his, arm under his head and his long lashes black on his cheek. And she, oh dear, And then, having had a Mr. Darcy moment, the girl really wished her dad would still turn up because she wanted to explain that she hadn't invited him in and it was, how it had to be. But of course, the father didn't turn up for a long, long time yet. So come the dawn, she could see her handsome stranger with his lovely long limbs like a statue and his dark hair all curling away from his ears. And she, oh, he's lovely. And then she saw that his ears were rather strange. They might be pink and they might be beautifully formed, but they were very, very pointed like a horse's ears. And she thought, oh dear, what's happened now? And then, just a bit pointed. So then she realised that he was a Glashin, which is a man from the sea, who could change into a water horse. And all he really wanted to do was to drag her into the sea, and she would never be, and drown her. So he woke up, and he offered her a fine string of pearls, the like of which she would never, ever, ever see in real terms. And she said, no, I don't want them. And with that, he snarled, he leapt at her, he tore her dress, he wanted to drag her out of the house and down into the sea. And then the cock crowed. And with that, he dropped her, his teeth got sort of longer and sharper, he flew out the door, and immediately she could just hear this horse galloping away at very great speed. And she was obviously in a right state. Excuse me. And so it was her screams that had woken up the cockerel in the first place, actually. And he ran out the door. Then her father returned, apologising he couldn't get home, but he'd stayed the night with a neighbour because it was so awful, but he knew she'd be safe and all the rest of it. This poor gibbering wreck of a daughter tries to explain what's happened. He gets that she's not lying and hasn't had her boyfriend in, that it's actually real what has happened. And she eventually recovered from this great event and told the story for the rest of her life. And in the end, she got married and she had kids, and she went to live in Marone on the island, which is the only parish where you can't see the sea and you can't hear the sea. So the trauma never really left her. So then at Laxley here, once upon a time, there was a Domini Oi, a night man, and he was living in a cave on the cliffs beyond Laxley there, and he blew his bugle horn whenever there was a storm brewing. Now, like a lot of these creatures, he was basically kind-hearted but a bit thick, and that was his job. He could blow the horn when there was a storm coming. But after 50 years of it, he was blowing it morning, noon and night because he was fairly bored waiting for storms, and he was driving everybody up the wall and back down again. So good old, a woman called Nance Corlett, again, it wasn't a man. I did look, I lived in high expectations that a man would deal with it, but he didn't. It was Nance Corlett who dealt with it. And this tooting was, as I say, driving everyone scratchy. So even on summer days, no point, but he wouldn't stop. So a woman from Laxley sent him a note that he couldn't read. Less noise up there and oblige, Nance Corlett. So obviously he took no notice. So Miss Corlett decided he needed a lesson learnt and went to have it out with him. Excuse me. He was nowhere to be seen because it was a fine summer's day. He kept everybody awake all night, and so he was in his cave having a small sleep. But on the ground, she saw his horn, his bugle horn, and so she thought, right, I'm taking that, and I'm going to put a stop to his tooting. So she went home, and she poured a pint of goose fat into his bugle, and then she had to get it back to him. What did she do with it? Yeah, so she took it home, poured the goose fat into it to mute it. He was very understandably upset and fretted for hours until the fire, she then gave it back so he wouldn't notice it had gone. And he fretted for hours, and the night got cold, and he's sitting around his fire saying, what am I going to do now? You know, I've lost my job. And then the fat got melted by the fire, the warmth of the fire, and he put it to his lips, and of course it burned him because it was made of metal. And so he threw it over the cliff and into the sea, where a man of the sea found it and didn't know what it was. And he picked it up and threw it back, and it landed outside Nance Corlett's house. So Nance gets up thinking that was a good night's sleep. That was a job well done. And then she goes out to feed the chickens, finds the bugle, and she thinks, oh dear. And she says, give a thing, take a thing, God will send a black thing. So she took the horn home, back indoors, she polished it up, and she took it back to where the Domini Oi lived with a note that said, if you blow when there's no storm coming, it will be took away by Miss Nance Corlett. So again, he had to wait for a passing seagull who could read. This was a one-eyed seagull, this one, who read the note this time. And so she left him a cake as well to show there was no real ill will, but he just had to stop. And she ate the goodwill cake she'd left him while he'd waited for the seagull who could read to come by. And then he was so scared of her and so loved his bugle that he only really did blow it when there was a storm coming. And then you could hear him from one end of the island to the other. So these are charming moral stories in lots of ways, really. The other thing about Laxley is that it has one of the wonders of the world. It has that, which is the most enormous water wheel, where the wheelie bit is 6 feet across. And it was built in 1854 to pump water from the mines at Laxley. And it's known as the Lady Isabella, as the designer named it after his wife. And I was just wondering what Posh would have thought if Bex had named his football stadium after her, because that's huge. You know, you can't do that to ladies these days, really, for big things. And why I've included it is because it is as miraculous as any of the stories I've been talking about. It's the largest working water wheel in the world at 72.5 feet. As I say, it's 6 feet wide, and it revolves 3 times a minute. And they're so proud of it on the island that it's on the back of the £20 notes. So I do think that it does stand as a legend, that thing. Can't have us talk about the island without Gerald Gardner. And as Neil said, I have the Atlantis Bookshop in Museum Street in London, and we are proud of it for many, many things. It's going to be 98 years old on the 21st of March. It's a family-run business. It's 3 generations of us have run the shop, all, oddly enough, all women, because my dad died. But Alistair Crowley was one of our customers, Austin Spare, Dion Fortune, Tolkien, W.B. Yeats, you name any of the authors then or now, and they come to us. We're friends with so many people, and the shop always has been. I would say that shops are like pubs. It's either your flavour or it isn't. And mercifully, we suit a lot of people, really. But Gerald Gardner, I am particularly proud of, because our founder, Michael Houghton, was a non-observant Jew who became a theosophist. And then he knew Crowley, and then he knew Gardner, and became a Gardnerian. And it was partly so Gardner's coven could meet in our basement for years before witchcraft was legal, because it wasn't legal till 1951. And Michael published High Magic's Aid that Gerald Gardner didn't write but put his name to. And it says Michael Houghton, 49A Museum Street. So it was used as a beckoner, that if people read the novel, liked it, they had an address to write to. But because of the Helen Duncan thing, which had brought the word witchcraft back into national consciousness, because it had just been a weird thing that, people in, country villages get called. We still get it. We're called witches even if we're not. I'm very proud to say I am one. But, if you're interested in this stuff, you get called a witch. So back then, when teachers and bank clerks and people like that had social status, it was a very, very, very brave thing to do, to get naked in rooms with strangers. And they were a brave lot, really. And it was, as I say, it was illegal. But Helen Duncan trial publicised witchcraft again. And Gerald Gardner was English, was a civil servant, travelled the world, never really lived in England, till he came back here, couldn't stand how cold it was, so found a nature club, because he was used to the sun, and he was a real sun seeker, a real sun needer to that extent as well. Bumped into some people who were witches, got initiated, and he had the personality, he had the charisma to lead the movement. He had no ties. He had a semi-devoted wife, and he had enough money that he really didn't care, and he wasn't bothered about being discreet about it. And they wanted, after wars, countries need re-greening. If you look at the music and the poetry and the novels and the way people lived after the First World War, there was this back to the land movement then, and then it got revived with the witches and the folklorists and everybody else after the situation that had happened, to England as well as the rest of the world during the Second World War too. And people came back and wanted a different way of life, and they weren't going to be regimented ever again. So he liked the idea of witchcraft. It suited him, and as I say, he was nominated, self-appointed figurehead for it all. In the 30s, which was the heyday of part of the long heyday of tourism on the island, a bloke called Cecil Williamson set up the Witches' Mill, Museum of Magic and Witchcraft, in Castletown. Williamson was not a people person. He was perverse, he was awkward, he was very knowledgeable, but he was a manipulator, he was a spy. He'd worked in the film industry, so he set up the museum with lots of props, really, rather than anything much authentic at all. Became friendly with Gardner. Gardner bought him out because they had rows and things. Gardner decided to put it on the map, and in the early 50s, once witchcraft was legal again, it was a friend of Crowley's, who was a young MP on the make called Tom Dryburgh, who pushed through the Witchcraft Act. Very strange thing for a young MP on the make to do, but he did, so that was fine. And so he went to the Isle of Man, and I'd always thought, well, why the hell did he set it up there? Nobody goes to the Isle of Man. Back then they did. And whilst Gardner never forgave them for not allowing him a liquor licence, he did have a restaurant there, which added significantly to the financial gain of the business. He had a wishing well, which he emptied virtually daily, because people can't resist throwing money into wishing wells. He knew how to turn a coin, old Gardner. He was good. He also had a big barn there, and they held dances and things like that. And then afterwards, they would, when the dance was over, then the witches would use that space for their rituals. It was so easy to get to, you see, if you came from Ireland or North or anywhere like that. And he had the London Coven going anyway. You can see that the windmill is derelict at this stage, and it took a lot. But again, it was post-war. Nobody had anything of anything to do things with. You still sent parcels to people that were done up with, third-hand brown paper and knotted string. It was a very, very, very different world. You couldn't get a gang of builders in and, from Poland and say, all right, then yours is the cheapest rate, I'll risk it. He was a little old man trying to do things virtually single-handed. And you'll forgive me, but in my experience, most witches and pagans aren't the most practical people in the universe. And so them offering to re-brick the windows or something like that would never have worked either. But he went down a storm on the island. They absolutely loved him because he was charismatic, he was chatty, he would sit there taking the money and spinning yarns and talking to everybody all day, every day. But what he did for witchcraft is legendary because he got the devil taken out of witchcraft. And it's thanks to him that we are seen largely as a fairly anodyne sort of, weird religion these days. Witchcraft is the only worldwide religion, or the only religion at all that the UK has given to the world. And it's more than folk belief. It has a beating spiritual heart to it. And that's one of the things that Gardner stressed. As I say, he was massively, massively important. And the Christians had given Williamson a hard time, and the local bishop had written a paper saying, everything that's wrong with witches, you're sincerely the local witches. And Williamson had fought him back on it and kind of won on points. Gardner didn't bother with any of that. He said, you Christians gave us a devil centuries ago. We still don't know what to do with him. And it's still true. But we do have this hairy man who is full of male virility and vitality and necessary for nature to take its course, as are women. And women and men meet as equals as witches. And we have no time for the devil and all his works, and we're absolutely not interested in it. And so he deserves a bigger place in that. For that, he deserves a bigger place in witches' consciousness and in other people's consciousness than he actually does have. Most people think that he was a bit of a dirty old man who liked whipping young ladies as they danced around the fire when they were naked. There was an element of that, but but there was far more to it than that. I was talking to an old witch several years ago, and he said, well, of course, Geraldine said, of course the better-looking witches get promoted quicker. Why wouldn't they be? Don't be daft. But in both his day and especially in Cecil Williamson's day, it was a bit Hammer House of Horror. It was spooky and all those sorts of things. Williamson didn't have much that was authentic at all. He said he did, but it really boiled down to not much. And also, if you tried to fill this room with artifacts of stuff, after you've put a couple of broomsticks in there and somebody's cauldron and all the rest of it, where do you go from there? This is a big enough space to try and fill. And then, because the witches were still in the besom closet, then it was hard to find these things. And so, of course, it involved folklore and horse magic and all these other things. They had to fill it up with the artifacts, really. So Gardner bought it, revamped it, stopped it being quite as kitsch as it had been. And, as I say, he rode in on the back of the poor Helen Duncan's trial. So there he is. my dad and he were friends, and he used to say, he was in again today, kids, king of the witches. His hair goes this way and his beard goes that way. And as an asthmatic Gemini called Geraldine, I thought he was a rather marvellous man. And I saw him one day during the school holidays. I didn't get introduced because I was only a kid, but I did actually see him. And I'm one of the few people who haven't reached their 80s yet who saw Gardner. So I'm very pleased about that. So, the Manx cat. How could we forget the Manx cat? So all witches have been associated with cats because we all need familiars. We all need critters to go off and do our bidding. It's a bit like a well-trained dog, only it's a well-trained cat. And they understand us. There is this non-verbal communication that we all have with lots of things. We all have cars that we name. You know, I had a car, and I swear that car could breathe in when I was doing something that I really shouldn't have done. It could narrow itself so I could get through the gap and stuff like that. We all have all of that, and it's just not ascribed to witchcraft usually. But the Manx cat is peculiar to the island, and it was recognised as an official breed about 100 years ago. And there's a little rhyme about how they lost their tails, and it says, "The Manx cat said, 'Bebo bend it, my tail's ended, and I'll go to man and get copper nails and mend it.'" So I think that's lost something in translation, or it's lost a couple of verses, but never mind. So I've updated one of the folk tales of man for this one, because it goes back a long way, but I thought I'd bring it right up to now. So for this Manx cat, you've got to imagine that she's actually one of those irritating little millennials who thinks taking drugs all right because they're organic, and won't have chips in case they're not vegan, and doesn't actually want to work particularly hard, but does want to get to Goa or South America and become a shaman and all the rest of it. And basically, she's got tons of attitude and not many skills. And so this is this little Manx cat with a rucksack. So there's a folktale that says, a cat who lived in the south of the island wanted to travel, and because she'd said, "A person doesn't see much at all living in one place all her days, and I'm hearing the cats in Ramsey are wearing tails." And an old cat said that they'd never ever had a tail, nor had their mother, nor had their grandmother or great-grandmother before her, and dismissed this mad capers that go on in young people's heads these days. And of course the young woman went on her way, and she walked and she walked, and she got hungry, but was too busy to hunt except for a little mouse that she found and devoured when nobody was looking, because it was organic, obviously, it lived in the country. And she stopped at a farmhouse and asked the farmer for a little cream, and he asked her what she'd do to earn it. Could she catch rats? Little Miss Hoity-Toity said she wouldn't demean herself to do any such thing, and explained that other than a little hunting for herself, she wasn't prepared to work, really. She was travelling the road for her own health and edification, and suggested that he got himself a common cat to catch the rats. So the farmer then asked her what she would do for some cream, and she offered to sing a song, and said she was reasonably good and could purr as soft as silk. So the farmer invited her into the house because he thought it might amuse his wife, I suspect, and soon she was by the fire and purring away happily, very prettily, with an empty bowl of cream by her side. She explained that where she came from, the eating and drinking were really quite good, and cats like herself wouldn't put up with discomfort, but only the softest cushions of a choice feather beds was good enough for them. So the farmer's wife said that she'd heard that the tails on cats were mostly worn by the high-up cats on the island, and that the first Manx cat lost their tail getting it shut in the door of Noah's Ark when she was staying out mousing, and only got to the Ark in time before the door slammed. "Oh," said the young cat, "that's all nonsense. The first of my family came from Egypt, where she sat on the steps of the throne. Travelling is in us cats' blood, and that's why I'm travelling now, and intend to go to the end of the world and back, except that I'll refuse to cross water." After a good night's sleep and a big breakfast of more cream, she set off and soon met a sheepdog on his travels. On his way, he was working. He was on his way to collect the cows for milking. So little Miss Hoity-Toity told him that it was only ignorant hearts, like ignorant beasts like himself, that needed to be working, and on she went to Castletown, where she was genuinely surprised to find the local cats ignoring her, despite her patronising smiles at them and gracious nods of the head as she walked past, and as if she was the governor's lady. The impertinence of some of them, she thought. Not one of them has a great-great-great-great-grandmother who was at the royal cat in Egypt, so I'll go to the butcher's and get a lamb's tail, and then they'll notice me. Well, how the local cats laughed when she got one. They just couldn't stop themselves. They wouldn't look her in the eye. They just couldn't, but she could see their little shoulders heaving, and they were just deeply, deeply amused. This obviously he told her that she'd never get in, as the governor's lady was taking tea with her own cats, who were from Siam and from Persia. Well, of course, our millennial heroine got an audience. She just wangled her way in, really. It's like saying, I'm on the list, I'm on the guest list, isn't it, really? And graciously bowed, and was gracious enough to wish her ladyship that she had enough herring to keep her household fed forever. So she was asked to sing, so she caterwauled her way through a few old favourites, and the Persian and Siamese cats joined in the choruses until they were asked to stop, as the parliament next door was being disturbed by them. They all had cream together, and she wiped her mouth with her paws, as she'd been well brought up and knew her manners. The next thing she knew, she was by the hearth at home, and an old cat told her she'd been dreaming, but our millennial puss knew better. So that is some of the folklore of the Isle of Man. Thank you very much.